G'day mate, Luke Ford here, and I want to read to you from an interesting book that came out in 2011 by Tracy Strong called Politics Without Vision, Thinking Without a Banister in the 20th Century. So Tracy Strong wrote the introduction to the University of Chicago reissue of Carl Schmitt's classic, The Concept of the Political. So this is from the introduction. Thinking without a banister is the phrase that Hannah Arendt used to describe the status of and demands on thought in the modern era. Meant for her that humans no longer could rely on any transcendental grounding to finalize their thinking, be that God or nature or history. She saw this as both fearful and an opening of possibilities previously shut down. For the first time in perhaps 2,500 years, humans could think on the basis of thought alone. Indeed, to think authentically at all could be engaged in only without outside support. Thought, she said, could be absolutely and uncompromisingly of this world. That hope and that possibility arise in the context of the revolutions in human affairs that mark the 20th century as part of the story. Indeed, First World War marks a coming into consciousness of developments that had long been taking more and more evident shape in the West. The events of that war brought home to an incredulous Europe and America that political and social events had a logic and a course of their own, with awful results, subject neither to the restraints that might have been imposed by the intentions of leaders, nor to those that might derive from a pre-existent moral community. A century that had started with a celebration of the possibility of the rational control of human events by human beings had transmogrified itself into the frightening pointlessness of the Battle of Verdun, where during 10 months in 1916, more than 750,000 casualties were incurred in a struggle over a front line that never varied more than 2 miles. The 1920s were, on both sides of the Atlantic, a period of artistic and sensual flourishing, marked by sharp political conflicts between classes and interests. The surprising triumph and survival of the Bolshevik Revolution at the beginning of the end of colonialism, the eruption of the nationalist revolutions in China and elsewhere, all these and more mark a new place for politics in human affairs. Several texts, Friedrich Nietzsche had anticipated a transformation of the politics of the modern period into great politics, and of their transformation into an ideological war. Nietzsche wrote, "The concept of politics is being completely subsumed in an ideological war. All understandings of power have been blown up into the air. There will be wars, the like of which none has ever been on earth." Wow. So, great politics had brought all members of society into political conflict, inevitably political conflict with all members of other societies, a recognition that is at the core of the thought of Carl Schmitt. As world history developed, it favored Wilson and Lenin. Okay? So, the politics pursued by Woodrow Wilson and Vladimir Ilyich Lenin were not only remarkably like each other in their conception of what politics was about, but also radically different from those pursued by Clemenceau, Lloyd George, and most of the other leaders at Versailles. Clemenceau and his friends wanted to make sure that war never got out of hand again, as the Great War clearly had. They wanted, therefore, to make sure that the waging of war remained in the hands of and for the purposes of the elite. Wilson and Lenin sought rather to remake the very stuff of politics, in Wilson's famous phrase when asking Congress to declare war, to make the world safe for democracy. As the world history developed, it favored Wilson and Lenin. The war had involved the population as a whole. It was total, as Raymond Aron was later to call it. He was a French political thinker. For Wilson and Lenin, the purpose of war was to extend certain social relations, that is, to make concrete and universal dynamics potentially inherent in political and social development since the French Revolution. Such were the wars that started with World War I and saw their fuller development with the rise of fascism and National Socialism. Since the defeat in 1945 of the Axis powers, much of the political thought in the West has been devoted to developing the theory that would keep it from happening again. Many of the distinctions that political theorists and liberal thought in general have after 1945 drawn between thinkers are, in the end, answers dependent on a tacit question. What is the relation of this thought to the Nazis? So we see the New York Times doing this ongoing series on nativism and who are all these scary immigration restrictionists. There's that scary heiress lady who left money to environmental and immigrationist restrictionist causes. Then we've got big profiles of Stephen Miller in the New York Times and Washington Post today. And underlying all of this is this simple question: what is the relation of this thought to the Nazis? That's what politics has boiled down to since 1945. Okay, we look at every strand of political thought since 1945. How did it lead to, how did it resist, or how was it blithely ignorant of the Nazis? So Judith Shklar can, in a review of Charles Taylor's Sources of the Self, a book about the making of the modern self, suggests that a problem with the book is that it is instructive only to those who fear skepticism more than evil. American political science Robert Lane was only one of those who argued that too much participation is a bad thing for democracy and that to function properly, the political realm requires, as Lane puts it in Political Ideology, a touch of NMA. That means carelessness, lack of regard. There is nothing wrong with reading the present through the past. Doing so, however, constitutes a sorting device that places thinkers into anachronistic categories. The tacit Nazism question, right? That's what politics has boiled down to since 1945. And that's the point that Tracy Strong makes in this terrific, thoughtful book, Politics Without Vision, Thinking Without a Banister in the 20th Century. This book came out in 2011. Then Chapter 6, Carl Schmitt and the Exceptional Sovereign. One of the questions on which I focused in the chapters on Weber, Freud, and Lenin was the rise during the first years of the last century of an intensified concern with the figure of the leader. Not just a leader, but kind of a super leader, a person with qualities that transcended the ordinary. Though I presented arguments against this view, one can apparently plausibly make the claim that responsibility for at least the initiation of this tendency lies with Nietzsche. This focus was a result of many factors, but foremost among them was the way of dealing with the making of judgments in a world where certainty was understood to be in principle unavailable. Let me play a little bit on Carl Schmitt from the YouTube channel and podcast Philosophize This.
Political philosophy is going through a serious transition phase, because in many ways, the world is going through a serious transition phase. Revolutions are taking place, world wars are on the horizon, the rise of fascism, authoritarianism. The entire legacy of the Enlightenment is being called into question. And what this means for the world of philosophy is that the thinkers doing their work during this time are very quickly coming face to face with the realization that in this post-nuclear world, where for the first time the consequences of war could threaten the entire existence of the human race, they are the people that are going to have to figure all this out. Think of the pressure these thinkers were faced with at the time. To be a thinker born into the early 20th century is to be born into a world where the strength of your ideas is going to be tested in real time while the fate of the world hangs in the balance. Being born into this time period is like the forces of history commandeering you for one of the most stressful jobs.
Okay, before the Second World War, indeed before 1934 or 35, Carl Schmitt had been of importance to thinkers across the political spectrum. Though always a man of the right, he was influential on prominent members of what was to become the Frankfurt School, a group of left-wing critical thinkers also strongly influenced by Marx that included Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and Walter Benjamin. Recent work has found important influences of his work in the thought of people like Hannah Arendt and even in so-called postmodernists like Jean-Francois Lyotard. Indeed, in The Politics of Friendship, Jacques Derrida devotes several chapters to Carl Schmitt. In the middle of the political spectrum, important liberals such as Karl Friedrich and Hans Morgenthau found considerations of significance in Schmitt. Yet Schmitt was a willing member of the Nazi Party, and he expressed anti-Semitic statements both before and after the Second World War, albeit with more public restraint in the post-war period. So why should one pay attention to him? Anyone writing on Schmidt has an obligation to give an account of what in his work is worth the effort. This is a matter neither of freedom of thought, which would reduce interest in Schmidt to preference, nor of knowing your enemy. The question is rather to know who your enemy is and for what reasons. Any account here must be substantive. For me, Carl Schmitt gives us purchase on questions like these. What are the reasons for the gradual and apparently continuing domination of executive over legislative power in Western democracies during the last century? What is the relation between various phases of Western industrial democracies, on the one hand, their adherence to rights, liberty, and social welfare, and on the other, their repressive disciplinary qualities, not just domestically, but also given power internationally, imperialism, colonialism, support for authoritarian regimes, regime change. In historical terms, are we to think of fascism as a possible development of tendencies in modernity or as an aberration? So I was listening to John Mearsheimer the other day, and he called Vladimir Putin the ultimate realist, and he said that when Putin would meet Barack Obama, it was like Godzilla meeting with Bambi. Carl Schmitt is, with Martin Heidegger, one of the two thinkers considered in this book who joined forces with the Nazi Party. Central to Schmitt's concerns was the question of sovereign authority. What did it mean to speak in the name of and for a people, which is what a sovereign does? What is the case when it is spoken in the name of the people? How was such speech possible? What kind of speech was it? What was the relation between the rule of law and the political sovereign? As early as 1938 and again after World War II, Schmitt was fond of recalling Benito Cereno, one of Herman Melville's novels, in obvious reference to his choices in 1933 and after. The novel was translated into German in 1938 and apparently widely read and discussed in terms of the contemporary political situation. Benito Cereno, the title character, is the captain of a slave ship that has been taken over by the African slaves it is carrying. The owner of the slaves and most of the white crew have been killed, although Don Benito is left alive and forced by the slave leader, Babo, to play the role of captain so as not to arouse suspicion among other ships. Eventually, after a prolonged encounter with an American frigate and its captain, Maso Delano, during which the American at first suspects Cereno of malfeasance, cannot conceive of the possibility that slaves have taken over a ship, the story comes out. The slaves are recaptured and imprisoned, some executed. In a letter apparently written on his 50th birthday in 1938, Carl Schmitt signed himself as Benito Cereno. This passage from the end of the novel, although not one I know Schmitt to have cited explicitly, is it in particular relevant. Only at the end did my suspicions of you, said Captain Delano to Benito Cereno, get the better of me, and you know how wide of the mark they then proved? Wide indeed, said Don Benito sadly. You were with me all day, stood with me, sat with me, talked with me, looked at me, ate with me, drank with me, and yet your last act was to clutch for a villain, not only an innocent man, but the most pitiable of all men. To such degree may malign machinations and deceptions impose. So far may even the best men err in judging the conduct of one with the recesses of whose condition he is not acquainted. But you were forced to it, and you were in time undeceived. Would that, in both respects, it was so ever and with all men. And the other bloke responds, I think I understand you. You generalize. No, still the same bloke, Don Benito, and mournfully enough, but the past is past. Why moralize upon it? Forget it. See, yon bright sun has forgotten it all, and the blue sea and the blue sky, these have turned over new leaves. If the past is past, why moralize on it? The exchange suggests that for the two captains, or at least for Delano, in some sense the victor, initial judgments were simply mistaken. How could Delano have known the situation in which Cereno was caught? How was it the captain of the second ship wishes further to know that Benito Cereno was taken in by the evil brewing under his nose? Cereno notes that had he been more acute, it might in fact have cost him his life. Indeed, malign machinations and deceptions impose themselves on all human beings. He could not have done otherwise. Citing the Melville novella, Carl Schmitt appears to ready a self-defense to present to the victorious allies. That Carl Schmitt was fond of calling on the Herman Melville story is complexly revelatory. The captain of a ship might be thought to be the model of what we mean by a sovereign, yet here we have a story about a man who is obliged to accept a pose as being in control while going along with what is perceived as evil because his safety required it. Sounds like a plot from the TV show 24. At the very end of the story, after Bobo and the other slaves have been captured, the shroud falls from the bowsprit of Sereno's erstwhile ship, to reveal the skeleton of the slave owner murdered by the revolting slaves, and over it the description, "Follow your leader." Benito Sereno is about, among other things, what being a sovereign or captain is, how one is to recognize one, and the mistakes that can be made. So a religious or faith-based version of this is recognition of the Messiah, perhaps, or recognition of a divine miracle, recognition of God's hand in human history. My considerations here may seem to tread on dangerous ground, and they do. I do not propose to ignore Schmidt's choice to become a member of the Nazis, nor do I propose to rationalize it or downplay it or excuse it or have some commentators. Rather, I hope to show that Schmidt shares much with other writers considered here, and that he makes a ground for a shared ground that was widely acceptable. See the choice that Schmidt or Heidegger or many other German philosophers, theologians, lawyers, and artists, as well as people from all walks of life, and not just in Germany, not just then, made as blind or ignorant or from venal ambition, is to misunderstand his thought and life. It is also to sweep under the table what appeared as the appeal and apparent necessity of such a movement, and to avoid serious engrossment with why that movement appeared as such. Okay, and we shall see further, as with Martin Heidegger, in addition to Carl Schmitt, we can see through their eyes why Nazism could be seen as politically and intellectually attractive. For how long and for what cost. But it's important and natural to read Schmitt in terms of his relation to National Socialism. One must not forget that he was almost 30 years old when the Bolshevik Revolution occurred. Contrary to expectations in the West, it endured. It became necessary for any serious thinker, whether on the left or the right, to give an account of how what had appeared as an impossible task had been accomplished. As much as Carl Schmitt is anti-liberal, he also sees, perhaps even more importantly, a Bolshevik threat. Thus, like Max Weber, he sought to remedy what he perceived, not without reason, as the political weaknesses and immaturity of the German middle classes. So Carl Schmitt found that the introduction of universal suffrage for men in 1871 and for women in 1919 in Germany given rise to mass parties that were no longer able to debate political issues maturely. Powerful interests now apparently distorted rational discourse. In this, Carl Schmitt rejoins, of all people, Jürgen Habermas. Traditionally conceived, the state could no longer play the role of guarantor of security and order. Another power was needed. This was a new form of the executive, and this appealed across a wide spectrum. Okay, let me play a little bit from this video, Philosophize This.
Jobs in the history of the world. I mean, imagine your first day at a new job, and the orientation is, here's the entire history of Western civilization. And day one at the new job is, well, time for you to fix it all. Now get to work. Now, this job would be difficult enough if we were looking back at a history of total chaos in the West. But keep in mind, the Western world at this time is the self-proclaimed center of political thought. The self-proclaimed most advanced collection of societies that have ever existed in history. So if this really is such an advanced, developed environment that the rest of the world should draw inspiration from, why do we have such a rich history of things failing miserably? Think of the history this world is emerging out of. The Age of Reason and the political thought of the Enlightenment produced for us what we've long considered to be the greatest political strategy in existence.
Okay, let's go back to this interesting book by Professor Tracy B. Strong. Schmitt is the author of some of the most searching works of political theory in the last century, books whose appeal has over time covered the political spectrum from left to right. What is the nature of Carl Schmitt's importance and his appeal? Many of his concerns arise most clearly in Political Theology, a book originally published in 1922, represents Schmitt's most important initial engagement with the theme that was to preoccupy him for most of his life, that of sovereignty, that is, of the locus and nature of the agency that constitutes a political system. It is central to Schmidt's understanding of political theology that the experience of politics requires a theology to be viable. That is, politics must rely on a source of authority that has the quality of being beyond question. Something to be beyond question means that one must find that authority in oneself such that one can do no other than to acknowledge its claim. We live, however, in an age for which a transcendental source of authority is not available unless you believe in God. The unquestionable must be this worldly. Speak in these circumstances of a political theology thus means to speak of a politics in which it is held that problems cannot be resolved by universally agreed on procedures. The Constitution. The justification of a policy cannot be made in person-neutral terms. It must and can only be made authoritatively. If the liberal dream is the rule of law and not of men, then political theology says that this is a vain dream. A central question of a political theology must therefore be the status of the authority on the basis of which decisions are taken. In the West, such theological authority has typically been associated with a particular event that is authoritatively formulated, sometimes as a text whose meaning requires constitution, such as the Constitution. Okay, so the fate of authority in modern times, technicity. Question of authority under conditions of modernity can be approached only on a bias from the side, as it were. For Carl Schmitt, the political realm was the realm of relations between human beings, persons, as opposed to roles. Okay. Carl Schmitt phrased it the age of neutralizations and depoliticizations. This phenomenon was particularly intense in Weimar Germany. Carl Schmitt remarks that decades after Bismarck's ascendancy had broke the political mind of the German bourgeoisie, but also in general in the West. Central to Carl Schmitt is the political, a realm of human activity, separate and different from economics, religions, love, and so forth. Schmitt is concerned to preserve the political against the erosion he believed consequent to modernity. The political realm, thus the realm of the human, was for Schmitt in danger of disappearing. Modern times, he saw it being replaced by two realms. One realm was the supposedly neutral space of scientific technique in which rational and logical conclusions, neutral with regard to human beings, were attainable. So the political for Schmitt is the realm of that which is truly human. His distress is that the West is losing touch with that which gives life meaning. There have been 5 central spheres since the Renaissance, according to Schmitt. History of the last 500 years shows a common structure, even though as the controlling force has changed, so also what counts as evidence, as well as who were the social and political elite. Thus, in the 16th century, the world was structured around an explicitly theological understanding with God and scriptures as foundational certainties. This was replaced 17th century by metaphysics and rational scientific research, and in the 18th century by ethical humanism with its central notions of duty and virtue. In the 19th century, economics comes to dominate. And in the 20th century, technology is the order of the day. And this is at the core of his claim that ours is an age of neutralization and depoliticization, whereas all previous eras had leaders and decision makers. The era of technology and technological process has no need of individual persons. So, technicity is the striving for a neutral sphere. For Europe, the attraction of a neutral sphere is that it seemed to provide a solution to the conflicts that had grown up out of quarrels over technology and over theology. It sought to transform the concepts elaborated by centuries of theological reflection on what are now, for Carl Schmitt, private affairs. However, each stage of neutralization became, in Schmitt's analysis, merely the next arena of struggle. Thus, when what someone like John Rawls sees as one of the most important achievements of the West, religious toleration, Religious toleration for Carl Schmitt is merely the prelude to another form of conflict. One can argue that the achievement of religious toleration leads to the enhancement of the power of the sovereign. Central question now: what conflicts will arise when the central sphere is technicity? Danger arise because it is Russia, i.e. the former Soviet Union, that has understood and seized technicity and made it its own in the new arena of conflict. Only in Russia does one now find a sense of a new strong politics. So what is to be done? Schmitt writes the concept of the political. When a people no longer has the strength or the will to hoard itself to the realm of the political does not thereby disappear from the world. It is only a weak people that perishes. And Schmitt closes his famous Barcelona lecture circa 1938. The great cycle of the ages is reborn as it was in the beginning. An order is born as it was in the beginning. This is both a conservative statement, the order as it was in the beginning, and a revolutionary statement, a new order is born. According to Schmitt, there can be no clear-cut distinction between facts and values. Propositions about the world are not independent of the person who makes them. Claims to knowledge that are mistaken will not automatically be corrected by the world. In refusing these claims, technicity seems to provide a model of neutral resolution to disputes, and this was its attraction. Presuppositions, however, central to political liberalism. They ground the possibility of rational agreement. Schmitt's insistence on the necessarily and irreducibly human quality of political and legal action is key. According to Schmitt, human affairs rest on humans, can never be independent of them. Those who would elaborate a set of rules by which decisions can be made take the politics out of human life. Schmitt wants to keep them in. Human society can never be made to rest on the determination, application of rules to individual situations. Decisions and judgments will always be necessary. Thus, for Schmitt, the state is not co-founded with the legal order, and in exceptional situations, the juristic order that prevails is not of ordinary kind. In fact, the decision emanates from nothingness. The point, therefore, of this notion of sovereignty, ultimately constrained not just by no formal rules, but by nothing at all, is to create a juridical order. The sovereign must decide both that a situation is exceptional and what to do about the exception, be able to create or recover a judicial order when the existing one is threatened by chaos. So Schmitt writes, the exception, the state of exception in jurisprudence, is analogous to the miracle in theology. Thus, for Schmitt, the sovereign does not only define the state of exception, he is revealed by and in it, which is why Schmitt must refer to a genuine decision. What would be wrong with at least trying to rest human affairs on the rule of law? Schmitt finds two major problems. For Schmitt, we understand the nature of the juridical order only by understanding sovereignty, that is, understanding that which opens onto the province of the exception. The exception is more interesting than the rule. One can only have an exception if one has a rule. Thus, the designation of something as an exception is an assertion of the nature and quality of the rule. So political power is to be understood on the model of God's creation, which is how Thomas Hobbes understood it. Power is to make something from that which is not something, and thus to be above or not subject to laid down laws. This is akin to the miracle in religious thought. This understanding of power clearly draws on medieval theology. The sovereign is the action of us against them, friends versus enemies. This confrontation must take place at the metaphysical level of one faith against another. The confrontation is one of political theology. Schmitt is a realist, and he continues the line of thought initiated by Carl von Savigny, an important legal theorist in the first half of the 19th century, who argued that civil law acquired its character in the common consciousness of the people. So, the laws of the United States came from the common consciousness of people who regarded themselves as ultimately springing from England. At the time of the War of Independence, the American population came about 85% from England. So civil law comes from the common consciousness of the people. When you have very different people than Anglo-Saxons, the law is not going to speak for them, and ultimately it's not going to work for them. And for Savigny, the sovereign or the legislator was the expression of the common consciousness of the people. So Schmitt, as did Heidegger, came from a rural Catholic middle-class upbringing. And what then was the source of Carl Schmitt's attraction to Hitler is pretty clearly not an admiration of the particular qualities that Hitler had, even if one discounts the occasion. The disdain he expresses during his interrogation at Nuremberg is palpable. One might rather say that Hitler appeared to Carl Schmitt something like the entity God had sent to perform a miracle, and that the miracle was the recovery of a this-worldly transcendence for sovereignty and thus the human realm of the political. The person Hitler was nothing important, and Schmitt's relation to it could only be the relation one has to a miracle. You can either accept it or reject it. This is all the more likely as very rapidly Hitler seemed to many to behave like a true statesman in times of exception, legally elected, but capable of making the hard, extra-legal decisions that were necessary when, in the midst of increasingly public conflict between various factions of the party. So Germany was headed for civil war until Hitler and Goering ordered on June 30, July 1, July 2 of 1934, the execution of all of the leadership of the stormtroopers. In 2 days, almost all the press was congratulating them on having saved the country from civil war. Hindenburg sent a telegram of thanks to the new chancellor. Schmitt published on August 1, 1934, a newspaper article entitled "The Führer Protects the Law," defending Hitler's actions. Thus, it is the reality of taking power and manifesting sovereignty in the use of power that attracted Schmitt. His understanding of law required that he support Hitler. It was not a question of succumbing to the charisma of a prophet, true or false. So it wasn't that Schmitt was blinded by ambition, or that he misunderstood what Nazism was about. Schmitt thought the enemies of the regime were necessarily enemies of what it meant to be German. According to Schmitt, Thomas Hobbes was the greatest political thinker, perhaps the only truly systematic one. Hobbes was the thinker who best established the primacy of the political, the leader of the struggle against depoliticization. The concern with the total state appears to have led Carl Schmitt to rework his appreciation of Thomas Hobbes. In 1938, he published The Leviathan in the State Theory of Hobbes. It's likely in response to a critique by Leo Strauss. So Schmitt thought very highly of Leo Strauss, who Schmitt knew was Jewish. Schmitt included Leo Strauss's critique of the concept of the political in Carl Schmitt's 1932 edition of the book. Schmitt essentially did everything he could for the career of Leo Strauss. So, Carl Schmitt's argument in this book on Hobbes is that the new God that is created in the covenant of the Leviathan sovereign is a God only in a juristic sense and not in a metaphysical sense. The sovereign representative person cannot thus delay the complete mechanization of the state. Carl Schmitt, the Hobbesian state is not a total person, but rather a mechanism, and as a mechanism, it is incapable of any totality. So the groundwork is being laid for technicity. Schmitt now reads Hobbes as setting the stage for what will become liberal politics, and Hobbes's work will be furthered by Baruch Spinoza. Only a few years after the appearance of Hobbes' Leviathan, writes Schmitt, the glance of the first liberal Jew fell on the barely perceivable crack, immediately recognized the large fracture into which modern liberalism would fall, in which the whole of the relationship that Hobbes had constructed between interior and exterior, between public and private, could be inverted into its opposite. Hobbes, it appears, made a tiny mistake, but from that small hole, the whole dam collapsed. What was this crack that Thomas Hobbes seems to have missed? Why was it a liberal Jew, let alone the first one, who turned the crack into a great empty space? Carl Schmitt starts his book with a consideration of the mythic resonances of the figure of the Leviathan. On the one hand, it is a great aquatic animal and thus appropriate. The 17th century development of England is primarily a sea power, but says Schmitt, this is a political problem. A big fish became a symbol connected with the typical continental process of state building of European land powers. The English Isle, its world-conquering seafaring, needed no absolute monarchy nor a juridical system based on the state's law. It follows that the English would not appreciate Hobbes. Indeed, they took him to be the monster from Malmesbury. What could have been a grand signal of restoration of the vital energy and political unity became a grotesque horror picture. So here we are in the center of Schmitt's theory of political myth. If you invoke a myth, says Schmitt, you invoke all of the elements of it. No chain of thought, no matter how clear, can stand up against the force of genuine mythical images. Thomas Hobbes failed to realize he was conjuring up the invisible forces of an old, ambiguous myth. Tell yourself a story and you will become a player in it. What happens, according to Schmitt, is that as an agnostic, Hobbes makes religious truth not a subject matter for the state. Thus, in this book, Schmitt criticizes Hobbes for allowing the privacy of belief. Hobbes says it does not matter what you think as long as what you do is what the sovereign requires. It does not matter what you believe as long as you conform to the laws of the sovereign and do not hold beliefs that lead you to deny the authority of the sovereign. Hobbes designates the Leviathan a great man, but also a machine, by allowing private belief. According to Leo Strauss, in the 18th century, the Leviathan, as a godlike sovereign person in the state, was destroyed from within. The distinction of inner and outer became for the moral god a sickness unto death. So what survives is the machine. So Schmitt has given us a version of the story of rationalization and disenchantment. Leviathan is a great man, but a mortal god and a machine, and a monster. The conception of the state as a great machine itself rose from the distinction between the state and individual freedom. That happened in an age when the very organizations of this human freedom were no more than the knives with which the anti-individualist forces sliced up the flesh of the Leviathan and divided it among themselves. Thus did the mortal god die a second time. So who killed the second Christ? The answer was set up at the beginning of the book in Schmitt's discussion of the myth of the Leviathan. There he recalls the opposition between the sea monster Leviathan and the earth monster Behemoth. Schmitt elaborates his myth to the battle between two monsters. The Jews stand by and watch how the people of the world kill one another. In their eyes, such practices of ritual slaughter and massacre conform to the law and are kosher. That is why they eat the flesh of those who have died and live off it, according to Schmitt. The peoples of the world killed sovereignty, and according to Schmitt, the Jews as bystanders profited from the murder-suicide. In mythology, the Leviathan is also a serpent or dragon, a beast that non-Jewish people see as protective and benevolent, whereas Near Eastern and Jewish mythology finds it to be hostile and evil. Schmitt attacks Jewish philosopher Stahl Jolson for speaking in favor of the clear-cut separation between religion and politics, thereby extending the position already advanced by Spinoza and Moses Mendelssohn. Hobbes understood the need for the total state, but inadvertently left a crack that Jewish thought exploited into a full-blown fissure in Carl Schmitt's thinking. So Carl Schmitt blames the final destruction of the idea of a unified political realm on the Jewish and Near Eastern attitude toward the myths that made such a realm possible. In a recent book, Raphael Gross has made a forceful case for the claim that Schmitt's anti-Semitism is not simply that of a careerist, but embedded in the deep structures of his thought. For Gross, the Jew lies under one pole of each of the binary oppositions that Schmitt works with. The Jew is enemy, the Antichrist. Lacking spatial and territorial definition, these oppositions undermine all notions of nomos. Nomos refers to a particular land for a particular people. In other words, blood and soil nationalism. There is clearly something to Raphael Gross's accusation, but what exactly? Schmitt attributes to Leo Strauss the claim that Hobbes says that Jews are responsible for the distinction between religion and politics. Distinction that Schmitt says Hobbes considered nefarious. Hobbes, for instance, says in the Leviathan, the Romans made no scruple of tolerating any religion whatsoever in the city of Rome itself, unless it had something in it that could not consist with their civil government, nor do we read that any religion was there forbidden, but that of the Jews, who, being the peculiar kingdom of God, thought it unlawful to acknowledge subjection to any mortal king or state. For Schmitt, however, what is right in Hobbes is not so much that he is against the Jews as that he is against any disaggregation of power into religion on the one hand, and on the other, politics, including that by Catholics and Presbyterians. The ancients had no such separation. Hobbes knew this, and Schmitt thinks them and him right. Indeed, notes that Hobbes saw the sovereign as the lieutenant of God, thus as Pope, traditionally referred to as lieutenant of God, and ruler in one. But Hobbes did open up the tiny crack into which Spinoza and others rushed, and that they then enlarge. Here one must say that Schmitt's anti-Semitism is first and foremost an anti-Judaism.
Liberal capitalist democracy. By this time, for over 100 years, liberal capitalist democracy has been the gold standard in the West when it comes to how we should be structuring our societies. The problem facing political philosophers at the beginning of the 20th century is this. What exactly is it about our long-standing strategy of liberal capitalist democracy that seems to invariably lead society into an endgame of dictatorship, bloodshed, and political instability? When John Dewey and Antonio Gramsci show up with their lunchbox on the first day at the new job, this is the first order of business people like them are going to have to deal with. Now, it's right here that we can understand why the two of them went in the respective directions they did.
Okay, back to this book by Tracy Strong. The book is called Politics Without Vision, Thinking Without a Banister in the 20th Century. And I'm reading from his chapter on Carl Schmitt. When Schmitt says that Jesus is the Christ is the most important sentence in Hobbes, he is attributing to Christianity a political quality. It is to claim that the integrity or unity of political society is of central importance. To say that Jesus is the Christ is to say that he is the Messiah, that he is anointed and appointed by God to lead a people, and that what he does transcends all law. That the Jew does not accept this means that he will always be in contradiction to a unified society, the reason that he claims a source of right that is external to the society, that is, to the Jews' own understanding of God's law. Schmitt's position has some relation to Hobbes' distress with Roman Catholics, who had a divided loyalty. Carl Schmitt's anti-Semitism is not a biological anti-Semitism. Neither the Nazis nor Schmitt spoke of race when discussing these matters. They did speak of species. The problem comes from the fact that from at least 1923 on, Carl Schmitt claims that sovereignty presupposes the need for homogeneity of the political body, not pluralism. Thus, his anti-Judaism is part of his construction of national identity. First chapter of The Leviathan in the State Theory of Thomas Hobbes, Carl Schmitt had favorably cited the Jewish scholar Leo Strauss for his recognition that Hobbes had thought it important to struggle to restore the original unity of the spiritual and secular powers. However, Schmitt argues Strauss is misleading on Hobbes on Jews. Strauss seems to hold that Jews were responsible for the distinction between the spiritual and the secular realms. If it were the case that the Jews are solely responsible for the separation, then we could maintain, as does Leo Strauss, the incompatibility, but also the reality and thus the necessity of a realm of reason, Athens, and a realm of revelation, Jerusalem, God's law, which is necessarily in tension with political sovereignty. Referring to the Jew Moses Mendelssohn, Carl Schmitt notes that this latter's Jerusalem, or on religious power in Judaism, is also at the origin of the first great and important confrontation between German wisdom and the Jewish tactic of distinguishing. Jews, for Carl Schmitt, seek to profit from the space that Hobbes initially opens up between the secular and the spiritual. Bluntly, Carl Schmitt's anti-Semitism here is of a piece with his reasons for opposing pluralism and indirect powers. What makes Leo Strauss wrong also makes Hobbes wrong, and for Schmitt also makes all of liberalism wrong. There were such a thing as a non-crude anti-Semitism, Carl Schmitt seems to have it. What Schmitt is not is a liberal. So it's with some degree of irony that one could say that Schmitt's position resembles somewhat that of Marx in his essay on the Jewish question. In Germany, Jews had been granted political rights during the Napoleonic period. These had been withdrawn after Napoleon's defeat. By the 1830s, as Jews had moved into increasingly greater positions of prominence with the support of liberal Gentile political forces, push was made to grant political rights. Bruno Bauer, a young and left Hegelian, had argued that Jews cannot be emancipated because they cling to their religion. For Bauer, there can be no special claims, being recognized as a Jew and a citizen, or for that matter, as a Christian and a citizen. Marx's response was that this was empirically wrong, and he mentions the United States, and that Bauer had confused political and human emancipation. Emancipation in the modern state proceeds only by depoliticizing certain areas, such as religion. This simply preserves the realm of particularity and inequality. If property is no longer a qualification for voting, the regime of property still remains. The Jew has emancipated himself in a Jewish manner, Marx wrote, not only because he has acquired financial power, but also because through him and also apart from him, money has become a world power, and the practical Jewish spirit has become the practical spirit of the Christian nations. In effect, says Marx, what Bauer wants is to destroy the possible unity of human life by moving religion to civil society and separating it off from the political. In effect, human plays the role for Marx that political does for Schmitt. So if Carl Schmitt sought to strengthen and recover the possibility of a true unified people of Volk, what was his relation to Nazism? A Volk, a particular people, is not just a people, but a people unified by having a common history, a common language, and a common destiny. So we know that Schmitt joined the Nazis in 1933 and remained a member until the end. Many of his defenders argue, however, that his foremost concern in the early 1930s was to strengthen the Weimar regime. Schmitt's policy aims were certainly not to strengthen the Weimar regime as it existed, but by eliminating the elements deemed unconstitutional to replace the Weimar regime with an authoritarian nationalist regime that would express the real will of the German people. It is fair to say at this point Schmitt hoped that such a regime could be shaped by eliminating through such dictatorship the socialists of the left and the right, in other words, the communists and the Nazis. However, when the Nazis obtained 37% of the vote in the July 31, 1932 elections and 33.1% following November, the exclusion of the Nazi Party was simply not possible. Fearful of communism, both domestic and foreign, attracted by Hitler's decisiveness after his appointment as Chancellor, Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution remained in force, and possibly, as George Schwab suggests, George Schwab was the one who really translated and introduced Carl Schmitt's thought explicitly to America. Intrigued by the fact that the new government's actions seemed to confirm his theoretical writings, Schmitt had no difficulty in joining the Nazis. He proceeded to publish that same year State Movement People, in which he tried to develop an articulated sense of these elements. Schmitt gives primacy to the state. This was soon to get him into trouble with Nazi theorists, for whom the unity of the movement, as made manifest in the party as the leader's personification of the people, was primary. Schmitt, circa 1936-37, was severely criticized in two articles in a Gestapo publication. To be so attacked was not like getting a bad review. Such attacks were life-threatening. With explicit reference to Schmidt, Waldemar Gurian, a social and religious theorist of considerable importance and brilliance, who had been a student of Schmidt's and was now in exile in Switzerland, wrote an article entitled "On the Path to Emigration or the Concentration Camp?" This is the context in which Carl Schmitt wrote his Thomas Hobbes book. If he was protected by Hermann Goering from direct consequences, he nonetheless clearly had important reasons to be frightened. In his interrogation after the war, he indicates that until 1936, he considered it possible to give meaning to the Nazi catchwords. He claims that his Hobbes book was written as a form of resistance to and critique of Nazism. Martin Heidegger was to make much the same claim about his lectures on Nietzsche and his refusal there of any biological interpretation of Nietzsche's thought. As noted, Schmitt claimed to have written letters to friends in 1938, which he compares himself to Benito Cereno, the ship captain of Melville's novella. Forced to go along with the slaves who have taken over the ship, he sought to have those letters serve as a foreword to his Hobbes book. The book would thus have an esoteric message made necessary by a time of persecution. So esoteric means a hidden message that only an elite can decipher, as opposed to an exoteric message which everyone can understand. First, does the Hobbes book by Schmitt in fact constitute an act of resistance to the Nazi movement? And second, what does one make of such an act if there is one? And the author here, Tracy B. Strong, says several of the doctrines put forth in this book go against the orthodoxy of the Nazi state. Schmitt's attack on indirect powers and pluralism, the concept of the total state, thus with no privilege to a party, the apparent approval of the law state elements of Hobbes' state law teaching, the approval of the doctrine of no punishment, no crime without law. These do in some sense constitute a setting himself apart from official Nazi doctrine. The fact that one fell out of favor with what had become the official line does not mean that one was not in some important sense in accord with what the regime was trying to do. Trotsky remained a communist even after exile. Do these chapters, however, constitute an act of resistance? So perhaps the resistance comes not from what Schmitt chooses to say about Hobbes, but rather from Hobbes himself. Schmitt's engagement with Hobbes is constant and changing over the course of his life, and this is because Schmitt keeps coming up against questions that he cannot answer. According to Hobbes, natural law is eternal, divine, and described only in human hearts, but there are very few men who know how to examine their own heart and read what is written there. Thus, it is from written laws that men know what they must do or avoid. Schmitt's engagement with Hobbes brings him back again and again to the inextricable relation of the political and the normative. That he takes Hobbes seriously means that he cannot remain content with many of his own formulations. What finally are we to make of Schmitt's anti-Judaism? It's part and parcel of Schmitt's overall hostility to pluralism, to indirect powers, and to the political theory of the Enlightenment. Heinrich Meyer argues that Schmitt's anti-Judaism had a different source than Nazi anti-Semitism, but led him easily to attach himself to the Nazi position. It's also the case that his pronouncements on these matters during the period 1933 to 1936 are of a violence that goes well beyond a genteel bourgeois anti-Semitism. It is also the case that even post-war, although more quietly, Schmitt continues to espouse an anti-Judaism. Source of this anti-Judaism comes in Schmitt's belief that the event of Christianity is political rather than religious. And this comes from his engagement with Hobbes. In Leviathan, Hobbes writes that the proclamation Jesus is the Christ entails obedience to the laws of the sovereign, even if that sovereign be an infidel. So Jesus as the Messiah entails the establishment of the earthly kingdom and thus sovereignty. As Hobbes says, if then Christ, while he was on earth, had no kingdom in this world, to what end was his first coming? It was to restore unto God by a new covenant the kingdom, which being his by the old covenant had been cut off by the rebellion of the Israelites in the election of Saul, which to do he was to preach unto them that he was the Messiah, that is, the king promised them by the prophets. So Carl Schmitt picks up on this and draws a severe conclusion. The most important sentence of Hobbes remains, Jesus is the Christ, writes Carl Schmitt. Power of such a sentence also works even if it is pushed to the margins of a conceptual system of an intellectual structure, even if it is apparently pushed outside the conceptual circle. This deportation is analogous to the domestication of Christ undertaken by the Grand Inquisitor of Dostoevsky. Hobbes expresses and grounds scientifically what Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor does to neutralize the effect of Christ in the social and political sphere, to de-anarchize Christianity while leaving it at the same time as a kind of legitimating effect, in any case not to do without it. A clever tactician gives up nothing as long as it is not completely useless. Christianity was not yet spent. Thus we can ask if the Grand Inquisitor of Dostoevsky is closer to the Roman Church or to Hobbes' sovereign. Name your enemy and I will tell you who you are. Hobbes and the Roman Church. The enemy is our characteristic question as form. That's Schmitt writing. So Carl Schmitt defended the Inquisition as a model of fairness. It was a terribly humane measure when Pope Innocent III created the inquisitorial law. The Inquisition was probably perhaps the most humane institution conceivable, since it came from the standpoint that no one accused could be condemned without a confession. When in the course of a century the practice of the Inquisition degenerated into torture because one wanted a confession and had to extort it, that is indeed a dark chapter of cultural history, but seen in terms of legal history, even today the idea of Inquisition can hardly be touched, according to Carl Schmitt. Schmitt notes, as had Hobbes, that there is in Christianity a dangerous tendency to introduce rebellion into the political realm. Hobbes and Hegel in particular try to tame this tendency and make use of it in the political realm by linking religion to the state. Schmitt's approval is strong. For Schmitt, those who slow down the complete neutralization of what is important about religion for the state, that's holding back the apocalypse. So Schmitt finds himself in alliance with the Grand Inquisitor of Dostoevsky. So Hobbes and Schmitt think that the Leviathan as mortal god, hence as Christ Messiah, holds back the kingdom of God on this earth, or at least makes no move to bring it about. This is why this is a political theology and not a theological politics. Hobbes is clear that once the Tower of Babel destroyed the unity of the human species and the Hebrews elected Saul as king, there would and could be no actual kingdom of God on this earth until the second coming. Till that time that ends time, the eschaton, the kings of this earth, were in effect Christ's. They should therefore be obeyed in the manner that one would obey God as king. Earthly kingdoms thus are godly in that they hold back human instincts toward anarchy and chaos until the second coming. Jesus as God will be absent until he returns. We need all the more a Jesus of this earth, a sovereign. Till then, Jesus as God plays no real role in Hobbes' vision of politics. As long as people do not act contrary to the commands of the mortal God, they can think privately what they want. Like the Grand Inquisitor, Hobbes' politicization of theology keeps the anarchic truth of the God, Jesus, away from this world. This means that Jews who deny that Jesus is the Messiah constitute a threat to Schmitt's entire political doctrine. This is the oldest form of anti-Semitism given a new twist. The denial of Christ as the Messiah constitutes a threat to the possibility of political order and furthers the depoliticization and neutralization of humanity. So the friend-enemy definition of politics that underpins Schmitt's analysis has the advantage of keeping combatants from seeing their enemy as criminal. Schmitt writes in The Concept of the Political, as such, humanity cannot wage war, but it has no enemy, at least not on this planet. The concept of humanity eliminates the concept of the enemy because in relation to the enemy, one does not cease to be a human being, and hence there is no particular differentiation. Could, however, a conflict occur where one group conceives of itself as fighting for humanity, then its opponents will be understood as criminals and a danger to humanity. At the end of this book, Schmitt tells us the opponent is no longer called enemy, but becomes a breaker and disturber of the peace. Schmitt wrote these words in apparent response to the war to end all wars as conceived by Woodrow Wilson. They anticipate critically, however, the accusation of crimes against humanity that has become increasingly standard fare since the trials at Nuremberg. The grounds for this universalism, however, are laid in Pauline universalism. Universalism that claims to affect everyone in the same way. If the political requires friends, enemies, and conflict, then in the end, the universalism of Jesus' life undermines Schmittian politics, which is why Schmitt is on the side of the Grand Inquisitor.
Because like we talked about, the beginning of the 20th century can be broadly understood in terms of three major branches of political discussion, three primary conversations that are going on. We've already talked about two of them, and understanding all three of them is going to be absolutely crucial, because the contents of these conversations is going to go on to dictate the direction of almost all subsequent political philosophy all the way up to the present day. When a philosopher sets out to contribute something to the political discussion of the 20th century, they are almost without exception doing so in consideration to one of these three major critiques of the way we've done things in the past. Once again, what we've done in the past is liberal capitalist democracy.
Okay, back to this book by Tracy B. Strong, Politics Without Vision, Thinking Without a Banister in the 20th Century. Whether or not one accepts Schmitt's model of the church, the strength of his theory is that he recognizes that human beings will respond to the possibility of a vigorous public sphere. It's for this reason that the Volk, the people, legitimates and is legitimated by the sovereign. Liberalism, with its neutrality toward final claims, is incapable of providing this. Here one thinks of the works of John Rawls, who explicitly denies that his theory of justice requires a notion of truth, asserting that justice is composed only of that to which reasonable beings with a given similar history will rationally consent. This perhaps seems safer, but it may also make people yearn for something more and runs the risk that satisfaction of that yearning will be disastrous. The sovereign, in effect, provides a simulacrum of the transcendental realm that is no longer available, presuming people no longer believe in God. It is maintained by the importance of struggle, of having enemies, armies clashing by night, the basis of political stability. One needs enemies. Having an enemy is an honorable state. There are, however, consequences to construing matters as Schmitt does. First, you are not an enemy, and here it is telling that he portrays Jews as bystanders seeking to profit from conflicts. If you are not a criminal, then you are a monster. Judaism plays an important role in Schmitt's thought, as it is the source of the denial of Christ. In the picture that ends his Leviathan book, he gives us the reproduction of a strange image of a great sea monster. The picture makes sense only if one places it back in its original context. There, one finds that the sea monster is being caught on a fishing line by God using a hook of Jesus on the cross as bait. The picture in Schmitt's book eliminates everything except the recumbent fish, whereas without the Messiah, the Leviathan, says Schmitt, is an externally all-powerful and inwardly impotent concentration of power. When caught on God's fishhook, it becomes the total state. One can think of Schmitt's work as the attempt to create in this world the equivalent of the non-worldly God. Thus, Carl Schmitt gives us only the fish and not the whole picture as a warning of the consequences of Judaism. It can also be the consequences of any being that does not fit into the friend-enemy category. Our world has seen in increasing numbers, be it the refugee, the stateless person, the seeker of asylum. Second consequence appears in what Schmitt makes available as a kind of justification that the past American administration offers in relation to the war on terror. This book by Tracy Strong came out in 2011. Since any terror attack is by definition an exceptional case and monstrous, the United States at present Islamo-fascism takes the place of Judaism. Present president can claim to act with emergency powers, and indeed on September 14 and 23 of 2001, President Bush invoked the National Emergencies Act and afterward justified his actions, such as spying on individuals without court orders, because it is a necessary part of my job. Jay Beebe, the head of the legal counsel of the Justice Department, said in 2002 that the president enjoys complete discretion in the exercise of his commander-in-chief authority and in conducting operations against hostile forces. In a memo from February that year, argued that detainees have no inherent protection under the Geneva Convention. The condition of their imprisonment, good, bad, or otherwise, is solely at the discretion of the president. Very Schmittian. The actions of the past and perhaps the present American administration are thus entirely consonant with Schmitt's doctrine of exception, of the kind of justification that the sovereign can offer for his acts in such cases. It seemed to follow that the nature of modernity is to increasingly make all situations exceptional. William Scheuermann reminds us the United States has on its books a sufficient number of emergency powers established to allow the executive free hand at the rule of all aspects of this country. Past American administration ruled that certain prisoners of the War on Terror have in effect no status at all, not even that of a person charged with a crime. Carl Schmitt had followed a sovereign for a while and then renounced him without renouncing that vision of sovereignty. In his testimony at Nuremberg, he identifies 1936 as the date where he renounced the devil, presumably after the attack on him in the Gestapo publications. In Benito Cereno, the end was not so easy. The chilling and uncompromising end to Melville's account of these matters is as follows. And here's the end of this chapter on Carl Schmitt. As for the black, his brain, not body, had schemed and led the slave revolt with the plot. His slight frame, inadequate to that which it held, had at once yielded to the superior muscular strength of his captor in the boat. Seeing all was over, he uttered no sound and could not be forced to. His aspect seemed to say, since I cannot do deeds, I will not speak words. Put in irons in the hold with the rest, he was carried to Lima. During the passage, Don Benito did not visit him, nor then, nor at any time after would he look at him. For the tribunal he refused. When pressed by the judges, he fainted. On the testimony of the sailors alone rested the legal identity of Babo, slave, yet the Spaniard would, upon occasion, verbally refer to the Negro, as has been shown, but look on him he would not or could not. Some months after dragged to the gibbet, the tail of a mule, the black met his voiceless end. The body was burned to ashes, but for many days the head, that hive of subtlety fixed on a pole in the plaza, met, unabashed, the gaze of the whites, and across the plaza looked toward St. Bartholomew's Church, in whose vaults slept then, as now, the recovered bones of Arenda, and across the Rimac Bridge looked toward the monastery on Mount Agonia without, where, 3 months after being dismissed by the court, Benito Cereno, born on the bier, did indeed follow his leader to his death. If Kant left us with an ambivalence between the creator genius and the spectator, there are no spectators. Carl Schmitt.
The three major critiques are going to be John Dewey in his critique of traditional democracy, Antonio Gramsci in his critique of capitalism, and the guy we're going to be talking about today, the philosopher Carl Schmitt in his critique of liberalism. But where's the best place to begin explaining one of the most scathing critiques of liberalism in existence? Maybe the best thing to preface this with, just given the demographics of this show, is that when Carl Schmitt sets out to critique the doctrine of liberalism, he's not setting out to critique liberalism in the context that some living in the modern United States may think of liberalism. You know, that it's one end of a political spectrum diametrically opposed to conservatism, with these two poles being defined by the current state of the US political landscape. That's not the...
Okay. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.